I was so busy for so long while Sinners was in theaters that I somehow never had the opportunity to view it in that setting. I'm still incredibly salty about that fact, and I was so desperate to have a modicum of that experience that I bought the Blu-ray the first chance I got so that I could make up for having missed out on it earlier in the year on personal hardware rather than relying on, say, a streaming service. It took until the very end of December for my chance to view it to arrive, and I barely made it in time to include this in my upcoming Film of the Year 2025 list. Thank God. I would have felt pretty silly doing that list and not including this on it, at least, given some of the other things I managed to go out and see that year. So what did I think of it? Is Sinners grossly overhyped? Is it just as good as expected? Somehow even better than everybody except for like one of my friends says? Let's discuss. Short answer, Sinners is basically just as good as expected. I do not believe it is perfect. I have rated it 4.5 out of 5, but it is an incredibly good film, which is precisely what I expected from it going in. The longer answer, Sinners is a brilliant body of filmmaking, writing, acting, and slow burn storytelling. It is so competently made and intentionally constructed that at every turn I was left either guessing, despite knowing about as much as a person could know about a movie before seeing it, or completely changing my mind about how I felt about the movie quite often. Very many moments where I'd wonder what precisely Ryan Coogler was doing just for the question to be answered at some point later. He doesn't forget about anything, and what threads are left loose seem very intentionally so, which is great because I felt like I experienced a much longer film than I actually did, but also perhaps causes the film to be longer than some might find necessary. Sinners is also quite surprising as a result of how much it is able to pack into the runtime that it has. While it is well over 2 hours long, just under 2.25 once you cut out the credits time, but don't skip the credits because there's a mid-credits scene and a post-credits scene, both of which provide additional sets of closure. It rarely felt like it could have crossed 2 hours, and yet there's a lot to keep track of here between the, I'd say, 3 main cast and the relationships and history that are all delved into, and delved into far better than Coogler had any right to accomplish. The various different elements going in, such as the mild faith-based subtext, the antagonistic forces, not to mention how resolutely they are utilized. The heavy blues-based music stuff, and might I add that the score and soundtrack is really great here, both in terms of diegetic music and non-diegetic, and so many little details through everything that the viewer is going to forget about until they come back into focus, again, solely because of how much is happening. But you never ever feel like you're missing anything. Every important piece is right where it needs to be, and when it needs to be there, and the care with which Coogler keeps everything in motion behind the scenes ensures that it all works out. I mean, another surprising thing about Sinners is how honestly small its cast and setting both are. Somewhere around 2/3 of the movie is basically one singular location, maybe even more than that, and it's easier to forget this fact than it might at first seem. And speaking of cast, my God, everybody does such a good job here. 10 out of 10, no notes. Michael B. Jordan in particular really shines as the Smokestack twins. He does such a good job in these roles that you'd be hard-pressed to believe it's not two actual twins on camera, and that further goes to prove my point about the competency with which this thing is made. It's a technical marvel that they were able to accomplish that. So much to enjoy about this movie. I could spend altogether far too long going into every detail, but there's honestly just too much to unpack. The movie is brilliant in all the ways I have said, as well as in ways that I have hitherto been unable to mention. For example, the amount of long takes that occur, especially in the first act, sets the tone so damn well, and those decisions always work in conjunction with every other to make a wonderful film. The reason for my rating Sinners 4.5 out of 5, however, instead of granting it the whole 5 stars, is largely due to minor nitpicks regarding preference and pacing. Remember, minor nitpicks, these are by no means a big deal, but are just enough to hold back from a perfect score on my first viewing. First of all, though the intercutting of the end of the film, alongside its very last end credits scene, managed to sell me on the circularity of Sinners, I have to admit I was really hesitant about the cold open of the movie being a shot from near the end, before the card of one day earlier goes ahead to start all the buildup of what's to come. It's a good teaser for where things end up, sure, but I almost wish there wasn't the explicit one day earlier card in there, or some other subtle decision to go with this. As is, I felt it a little too in your face, I suppose. It's a very small complaint, but I tend to feel this way about most things that cut in a bit of the end before everything starts. My other complaint is just with a couple moments of pacing. I think the second act wears on a slight bit too long before the exponential climb into climax hits, but overall I wasn't too bothered. It was just enough that I was kind of noticing like, okay, can we speed this up just a smidge, just for me to get my wish like 2 minutes later, basically. As I briefly mentioned earlier, Sinners has a lot of slow burn energy going on, and there's a ton of build up to the first couple acts, so I eventually started to question when it was actually going to start paying off on the promises made. I needn't have worried because it all ended up alright, but I could definitely see a few folk really not jiving with the overall pacing of the movie. Finally, I can't say I was totally in love with the climax as a whole. There's a lot about it that is great, such as how thematically relevant it is, and how emotionally poignant too, but there's also just enough chaos in there, and the spark that causes it all to really start is a little bit unbelievable in my opinion, and it makes me feel like the film loses its groundedness in the action just a tiny bit. And sure, I know it's rich to talk about groundedness considering the kind of forces our main characters find themselves against, but Coogler does such a good job trusting the viewer to understand and interpret so much of the film leading up to this point, or at least thankfully doesn't waste time over explaining anything, especially where the antagonists are concerned, that for the climax to be in a couple of moments a tiny bit too action forward compared to the grit that it is trying to convey, it just lost me a tiny bit. Not a whole ton, and not even for very long, but just enough to notice. And also, some of the special effects in the climax get a little distracting compared to, again, how real they seem the rest of the time. But all in all, I am glad I finally circled back to watching Sinners before the end of the year. Given that it has been on my radar since it first came to theaters, I would have felt awfully silly leaving it out of my upcoming 2025 Film of the Year ranking video, just as I said before. And I wanted to be able to review it in some capacity anyway, so I am very glad indeed that I got to carve out time for it right before the turn into 2026. The video version of this review is out now in January, to be clear, because the writing of this and posting on Letterboxd happened before. If you haven't watched Sinners, I recommend it, and I also recommend checking out all of the behind-the-scenes material as well, whether for the film or for the music, because there's a lot to enjoy in that stuff too, and boy do I only know the beginning of how much reading I could do with regard to historical context and so much more to really bring out the depth of the movie even more, but I'm content with the experience I got nonetheless. Props to Ryan Coogler for making this thing, and I am happy for the success it has had. I will absolutely have my eyes on the lookout for his next movie, because between this and the first Black Panther being easily one of the better films of the MCU, at least of the ones that I have actually watched, it's apparent he has a lot of creative juice in him, and I look forward to seeing more.